Hello, my name is Kate Chadbourne, and I'm here to talk to you today about my new book called A November Visit. I live here in Lunenburg, and I'm a singer and storyteller, a poet and writer, and a teacher. And I've just written a book that includes a lot of music and poems and stories and Irish folklore. A November Visit was inspired by the character of November, who came to me one day when I was writing a story. And I realized that November was this kind of bleak but honest being. And I really do think that's how November comes to us. I like to say that between all the parties of earlier in the fall and the parties to come later, in around Christmas time and New Year's, we have this time of November, which we sometimes kind of hurry through or get through, and it's darker and colder and bleaker. And this character presented herself to me, and I came to understand that there was more to her than I had previously thought. How long have I been a writer? I've been writing really since I was about 5 years old. Probably, I've been certainly telling stories since my little mouth would start going. And after that, I started writing with my typewriter. That shows you something about me, back in the old days, and have filled a billion journals and pages and little notebooks. And all my life, really, I think if you're a writer, you have a compulsion to words and to tell stories and to put things together. And I've always had that. So some fun facts about myself. Well, I'll tell you this. I love anything to do with being a writer, and that includes fountain pens. That is, you know, kind of crazy. I am mad about fountain pens and ink, and I love like lovely notebooks from Italy with beautiful imported paper. And I can't wait to get my hands on all of that kind of stuff. And recently, actually, my cat, so one of my funnest facts is I have a cat called Mish, whose name comes from the Irish Mishnach, which means brave. And Mishnach, the brave, just knocked over a whole bottle 2 days ago of scarlet red fountain pen ink on the floor. So we collaborate, Mish and I. I would love to share a sample of this, of my book. I thought what might be the easiest to understand and maybe set you up, you at home watching, to hear about the book would be the introduction. So I'll read out the introduction for you. All my life, I have believed that the happy fuss of celebration can keep us safe from life's darkness. I grew up among people who did not make a great deal of fuss. They saw it as a squandering of valuable resources like money and energy, and they preferred to move through time in a steady, tempered way so that most days fitted to a basic and unvarying template. Of course, I bucked against that. From early adulthood on, I've been a thrower of parties and a proponent of seizing every chance to decorate, cook, gather, and celebrate. Doing so certainly slows down the terrifying rush of time. We make memories. We shore ourselves up. We show up in our finery and shine together. In our little life that is rounded with a sleep, as Shakespeare puts it, this philosophy of festivity provides at least a partial answer to the question of how best to spend our brief tenancy on earth. We are here now, and we are making the most of it. We won't let it slip past without noticing. That's something, at least. I still hold to this view, and probably always will. I've also noticed that while the essential questions can be pushed back for a while, they don't disappear forever. I have sometimes felt quite hollow when the guests depart, and the only sign of the night's festivity is a sink full of dirty dishes and disarranged furniture. All the buzz and chatter, all the light and color and fun seem drained from the house. As I wander around the quiet rooms finding stray glasses and balled up napkins, I come to grips with the fact that it is over. This celebration I planned and cooked for is now behind us. Are we better off or worse, I wonder? What was it all for? Why give a party if it ends in mess and at least a slight depression of the spirit? In that moment, it is as though another presence enters the room. She wears no fancy dress and carries no glass of wine. She is the opposite of glamour. She might have been born 1,000 years ago from a cold stone at the seashore. I am still here, she announces. I am surprised to discover that a small part of me is glad to see her again. Perhaps this is the real reason I gave the party. This book gathers together poems, stories, rhymes, proverbs, journal entries, recipes, essays, songs, and other things that meet my very subjective judgment of what is Novemberish. Between the parties of earlier in the fall and the parties to come later in winter, we travel through a windy, colder, darker time. Certain unpleasant realities dawn on us. Thoughts we staved off in busier times return and knock firmly on the door. My hope is that this collection of Novemberish items will be good company to you in those bleak seasons, whether they take place in November or in other parts of your life. Not to deny or cover over the darkness, because trying to do so is ill-advised and ultimately impossible. Not to make it less either than the seasons of warmth and light. No, we need November. And if a friend appears to walk beside us under the blustery, dripping sky, so much the better. Thank you. Thank you, my friends. So November to me is both the actual month of November, but it's also seasons of our life when we are at a loose end, when those kind of bleak realities do come to us and we can't really escape them. And there's not a human life ever that doesn't have Novemberish seasons in it. They come in cycles, right? Like a divorce, a death, an illness, the loss of a job, change, really. And we are faced with those existential questions and have to greet them and find our way through them. So the book contains songs and stories and poems and all kinds of things that really contain that questioning and also that rock bottom, that bareness of November, again, the season or the kind of moment in your life. And but also I must say the beauties of November, I hope to include. There's something beautiful when the excess is stripped away and when we see the structure and the essentials of something. And sometimes that is the way through. So what is a bard? And yes, indeed, I do consider myself a bard. So I'll just say briefly that the bards of early Ireland were storytellers, historians, and magicians. And they were tasked with managing the collective memory and history of the group. They were tasked with creating stories to help them with that memory and also to launch imagination. And they were believed to use magic to do so. We know this because there's a glossary from the 9th century called Sanus Cormac, which means Cormac's glossary. Cormac MacCullinane, which means Cormac Hollywood, wrote this kind of dictionary in the 9th century, and he tells us some of the things that bards did and how they remembered their stories and how they made things up. And it was magic, what they did. They chewed on the flesh of certain animals to access this kind of supernatural wisdom. They were believed to be able to create effects on people's bodies, believe it or not. In fact, if you if they spoke a poem against you, it could raise boils of 3 colors. Believe it or not, you could have the red boil, which is what I think what we imagine a boil being red, the white boil, or the green boil. And none of that sounds particularly pleasant. So that's, bards could do cursing, but they could also do praising. And their praises were instrumental in keeping heaven and earth spinning along as they should. So I see myself very much in that tradition of bringing together that attention to the past and that desire to create new things and to serve my community with words and music. What Irish words or phrases inspire my stories, and what do they mean? Well, let me tell you one that's very central to this book, and that is cailleach, cailleach, which means hag or witch. And I really see November as a kind of cailleach. Cailleach in the Irish tradition is often associated with the end of the harvest. In fact, the last sheaf standing at the end of the harvest is referred to as the cailleach, and opposing teams of reapers would throw their reaping hooks at this last sheaf. And in fact, they wanted to be the first to reap the cailleach. But then the cailleach wasn't something that you really wanted to keep around because it was, after all, the hag. So she's both kind of lucky and unlucky. And according to Irish sort of myth, she is the oldest living being. So there are stories about her, I should say living person. There are animals that go back longer than the cailleach. The salmon, the Bradan Fasa, which means the salmon of wisdom, is the oldest living being according to Irish lore. But the cailleach, who is associated with November, in one tradition, the cailleach on Halloween, which is Iche puts the cold stone in the river. And that's how winter comes. So she's very much, I, in the book, write about my encounter with a cailleach when I had, I'll just say, unceremoniously been dumped. I was 20 years old, I was living in Ireland, I was in Bantry nursing a broken heart, and I had walked all day through the rain, and I finally came back to Bantry Bay where the swans come in on the harbour, and I went into this little hotel and I sat down next to the fire to thaw out, and this ancient, ancient woman came in, literally bent double, walking with a cane, and she said, "You, out of that chair." And I jumped up out of the chair because I couldn't not obey her. And she sat down, and the waitress came over and said, "Would you like a scone, ma'am?" And she said, "What good would one scone do anyone?" And I watched her polish off 4 scones in a big pot of scalding tea and then get up and leave without paying. And that's when I knew that I had indeed encountered the cailleach. So she's very much a part of the book. What is my favorite part about the month of November? I think my favorite part is the invitation to remember. You know, one of the things, at the back of the book, I have a section called 30 Ways to Enjoy November, because I really feel like November gets a bad rap. And one of them is to remember your loved ones who are no longer here. And I love to honor the tradition of making a little gathering of photographs and items that belong to some of my own beloved dead, and lighting a candle and remembering them. And I really do find that, you know, the Irish tradition says that Samhain, which is the first day of November, is when, so Iche Halloween, and Samhain is the first day of November, which is traditionally the first day of winter. And that's the season when the dead come home. It's the season of homecoming. And literally that was true in 19th century society, where especially the young ones who had been up herding the flocks on the mountains in the high places came home for the season. But it was also seen as the time when the dead literally came home. I love to remember this one man who was asked, "But aren't you afraid at Halloween with the dead so much, you know, around you?" And he said, "And why would I be afraid with them buzzing like bees all around me?" So that sense that you can bring, that the past is alive to us if we choose to encounter it, and that we can come close to it, and that it could actually nourish us in beautiful ways. This book is for you. This book is for anyone who is traveling through that windy, colder, darker time. Ultimately, I think the book says you are not alone. And that is my real hope for the book, that when there's whimsy in the book, and there's quite a lot of humor. There's some dark humor, there's some lighter humor, and there's some heartbreak. And all of that is part of our shared journey, I think. And my truest hope is that on reading the book, you'll know that it's human, and it's a cycle that you're moving through, and you will move through it, and you will move into the May of your heart. But for now, you're in the November, and let me tell you, you're in good company. You're not alone. That's what I hope. So what advice would I give to aspiring writers? I would say, make your writing important to you. The rest of the world does not require your writing. It might eventually, but very few writers have the divine opportunity to have somebody knocking at the door every day and saying, "Where's the writing?" Most of us write because we love to, because we want to. Nurture that part of you that wants to write, and make it important. I always say to young poets I know, take on the title of poet sooner than later. Don't let anyone dissuade you from that. If you write poems, you're a poet. If you write stories, you're a writer. You get to be a writer on your own terms. And the second thing I would say is, watch very carefully and listen very carefully to the kinds of voices you're allowing to influence you as a writer. Meaning, if it makes you feel like writing, keep listening. If it makes you feel discouraged or small or embarrassed, get out of it immediately. There's no need for that. There's a whole world. There is a fellowship of writers, and you belong in it. And we want to read your words. So please, ultimately, keep going. So in this book, I do wear two hats. I am a poet and writer on one hand, and I am a scholar of Irish language and folklore and a teacher of Irish language and folklore on the other. And how do these two interact and connect? Really, they feed each other. I have always, when I learn something, I want to write about it. Maybe it's the same for you. It sets my imagination going to learn new things, learn new phrases in Irish. The book is full of Irish proverbs, some of them about the cailleach that I mentioned before. Na trí ní is céire bí, the three sharpest things. There's so many, those are called triads. And that sets, what are the sharpest things? That sets my mind going. I want to think about that. There are many actually, and the answer to that, one of them is a thorn in the mud. Isn't that wonderful? And that gets my story writing mind going about life's thorns in the mud. So I really, when I was younger, I used to sort of struggle about this because I thought, well, what am I? Am I a scholar or am I a creator? And now I really don't worry about that. I really see that there's a flow back and forth between these things that feed each other. So it's actually turned out to be a wonderful asset to live in both worlds. So how does the book connect with my performances of Irish traditional songs and stories? When I do a lot of shows at live, especially before the pandemic, but I do a lot of shows of songs and stories at libraries and schools as a storyteller and a singer and a harper. And I'd say my watchword is variety. I love to sort of dance lightly between different kinds of things. I never want my audience to get bored. So, a story will be followed by a song, will be followed by a little bit of call and response, will be followed by something funny, will be followed by something sad. And that's really the model I've used in the book, that it is a variety. And so you move there's a poem on one page, and there's a recipe. Actually, there's my mother's wonderful recipe for applesauce walnut cake is in there, and there's an obituary, and there's a list of 30 things to enjoy during November, and it's just so much variety. That's what I like. It hits all, and it lets me write in all kinds of different ways that I really enjoy, and I think it keeps you kind of on your toes as a reader. There are some overarching themes and repeating characters. So November is definitely, she's a character that turns up in a number of different stories. Nadini Maya, the fairies, the good folk are there. There's definitely a heavy magical realist angle here. I'm a believer in magic, and magic enters into this book very much. The Kailach, who I mentioned, the hag, comes up again and again. I think that between a rock and a hard place is one of the themes that comes up. And then what are the resources we have for extricating ourselves from those challenges? And friendship, of course, and hope, and kindness. Those are themes that come up again and again and provide us, I think, all of us, with some answers and some ways through the November time. I want to thank you at home for watching and for connecting with me here. And I want to thank Jo McLaughlin very much for inviting me, and for Kayla too, for her wonderful hosting, both of their hosting. And I'd love just to say a farewell for now. I'd love to read to you a poem that is at the very beginning of the book as a way of saying goodbye. November waits for us at the owl end of autumn, after the apple blush, after the new shoes, after the maple fire, after the sweet spooks and mock hauntings of October. She appears to us quite bleak and bare. No finery, frippery, cushion, or dye. No slogan, no costume, no touch-up, no lens. November. I have nothing to hide, she tells us. Do you? Thank you very much.